The senator for Wisconsin.
Mr. President, on April 16, 2021, the House passed H.R. 1195, the Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare and Social Service Workers Act. That legislation, sponsored by Congressman Joe Courtney, passed the House 254 to 166 with the support of 38 Republicans. This legislation directs the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to issue a standard requiring healthcare and social service employers to write and implement a workplace violence prevention plan to protect employees from violent incidents. In the years since that legislation passed the House, we have been unable to generate the same level of support from our Republican colleagues needed to pass this legislation in the Senate. This is disappointing because the issue of protecting our health care and social service workers has never been more important. Roughly 3/4 of all non-fatal workplace injuries happen to healthcare workers. While it is too early to have comprehensive data from the pandemic, evidence from healthcare organizations suggests that workplace violence has exploded during the pandemic, nearing crisis levels for healthcare and social service workers. This workplace violence crisis is surely contributing to the staffing shortages that many healthcare employers have warned us about. In Wisconsin, vacancy rates for healthcare employers, for healthcare positions have been increasing, and threats against healthcare workers are viewed as the main culprit. These workers care for our loved ones and comfort us in our most trying times. They deserve to have the safe environment in which to do their work on that this legislation provides. So, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the HELP Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1195 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
The senator for Indiana.
reserving the right to object. So I come from the business world and know firsthand that employers care about their employees. If you don't keep your workplace safe, we just discussed it today in the budget hearing, they're not going to stick with you. And I think the question is about how you address those issues. I'm married to a lifelong business owner in our hometown, downtown, that would say the same thing. None of us that own businesses, unless you get very, maybe large, where you think you don't need to pay attention to basic common sense and rules, do you need something, I think, that addresses the issue from here. You know, I think that so often when there is an issue, there's just a tendency to reflex, to the federal government. What's not considered is the cost and how it might actually play out. In this case, I do acknowledge the issue, but I think the bill is in search of maybe a problem in the sense that we've got a mechanism that already works. I'll talk about that here in a moment. OSHA is there to find these issues and adjudicate them accordingly. And I think what this would do is not lend the marginal benefit, and would end up, like many bills, adding red tape and cost. It has two budget points of order as well. Those are complicated. I just believe there are better options. Let me talk about this. I introduced the Voluntary Protection Program Act that has the same approach in mind, aiming at the same problem. Did it with my colleague from Colorado, Senator Bennett. It allows OSHA to work alongside employers and workers to encourage businesses without going through the red tape or the dictate of the federal government. And it's been successful. It's not like we're trying to reinvent the wheel. It makes businesses exempt from bureaucratic requirements as long as in good faith they're trying to address the underlying issues. Look at this. In its current form, safeguards nearly 1 million workers, 700 local unions, and 2,200 work sites. VPP sites have shown injury and illness rates 50% lower than their industry averages. This is something we should be incorporating across the system because it's working, and it's working with an enforcement agency and businesses solving the problem before we give an overall framework from here down. It's been around for over 40 years, demonstrated its success. I think it would be a better approach to a problem I acknowledge it's just not being used broadly enough. After all, it's kind of the way I think things should work first before you create a law. I will ask for consent here shortly to pass the VPP Act. Let me add one important note that is personal to many in this chamber. 116th Congress was my first as a U.S. Senator. As a freshman, I was assigned to the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pension. And I had the great honor to serve alongside Senator Mike Enzi, who was chair of the Budget Committee. This was his bill. Senator Enzi was known as one of the individuals here never to shirk an issue, but come up with common sense ways that wouldn't add further to our debt, add more bureaucracy, and still solve the issue. This bill addresses a program that he cared about deeply, that needs to be put into statute to where it's used more broadly. And I was honored to take the lead on this act along with Senator Bennett. So my bill is a no-brainer. Employers get the choice to participate. It has a proven track record, and it makes workplace safer. It's a win-win for all involved. Therefore, I do object.
Objection is heard.
I'm
Senator for Wisconsin.
obviously very disappointed, and I would point out that a voluntary measure, as my colleague on the Help Committee just described, is not what we need when we step up to help protect our frontline workers in emergency rooms and in multiple settings where there is sadly an increasing propensity for violence. Yesterday, I met with members of the American College of Emergency Physicians, the people who work on the front lines in our emergency departments and emergency rooms across the country, as well as the emergency nurses. One after another, they shared stories of the violence they see and experience. I can't imagine walking into work every day knowing that this could be the day that someone was going to be struck or injured. A doctor talked about being strangled with his stethoscope. A nurse talked about hearing a fellow nurse being punched and then falling on the floor unconscious, and now with a concussion. I met a nurse several years ago from Wisconsin who was beaten so severely by a patient that she can no longer work in nursing. We are not talking about studying a problem and coming up with a voluntary solution. We're talking about a crisis happening to our healthcare workers, and at a time when they're also dealing with a pandemic. Healthcare workers, social service workers, nurses, and doctors have been here this week. We will have more coming next week. These frontline heroes who have endured so much deserve the protection of an enforceable OSHA standard, not just a voluntary program, which is already the status quo. And with that, I yield back.
Senator for Indiana.
As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration of S. 1081, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the Braun substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Senator from Wisconsin.
I suppose I prematurely gave my reasons for objecting as I responded to Senator Braun's objection to passing the Healthcare Workers and Social Service Workers Protection Act. But again, this is pretty much the status quo. If it's a voluntary program, it is not an enforceable OSHA standard. And these frontline heroes who have endured so much over the past few years with increases in violence and during the pandemic deserve the legislation that I've sponsored, the Workplace Violence Prevention Act for Healthcare and Social Services Workers Act. The House passed it over a year ago, and that's what we should be taking up, and so I object.
Objection is heard.